Boldwood presents The New Neighbour, written by Valerie Keogh and read by Rose Robinson. Chapter 1. I wasn't beige, that nondescript colour often used in a derogatory way to label people like me who didn't stand out. Even beige had too much colour to describe me and the life I now lived. I'd have chosen a very pale shade of grey, one almost translucent at the edges, so I faded, chameleon-like, into whatever I stood against. It was what I wanted. To disappear, as it were, into my surroundings. To vanish. To be unremarkable. I wasn't always this way. There was a time when my life had been defined by colour, all the ones in the rainbow and all the shades in between. I remembered being described as someone who lit up a room when they entered it, or as the life and soul of every party. My name had always been the first people put on a list of invitees. Friends would rush to change the date of a party or celebration to ensure I'd be there. It was hard to believe I'd once been that popular. Sometimes I'd sit, shut my eyes and think back to those times of fun-filled moments, and I'd try to remember what it had felt like to have everyone like me. All those people I'd known, their names tripping easily through my head despite the years that had passed. There had been boyfriends and male friends, girlfriends, and 4 very close besties. It had been a charmed life. And then, poof, just like that, it was all gone. All it had taken was one stupid mistake to make it all disappear. Once the colour is washed out of a life like that, it can never be put back. Chapter 2. My home is a small, terraced box on a road of terraced boxes, in a town full of similar roads. Once upon a time, the front door had been white. Time, car fumes, and dust from the pavement it opened directly onto had taken away its sheen, and it was now almost grey. I could have washed it, and the once white net curtains that hung from the single downstairs window. I didn't, because they suited me and continued the colour coordination with the life I now lived. The house had been carpeted but unfurnished when I'd bought it the month before. I sometimes wondered if I'd chosen it because of the carpet. A cheap, utilitarian grey one that covered every floor apart from the small kitchen and tiny bathroom. I probably had done, thinking it matched the future I could see unfolding before me. There were no friends to comment on the job I took in a local supermarket, none to laugh and shake their heads when they saw the uniform was grey, with darker grey piping. There was nobody to ask if I wasn't taking it all a bit far, to laugh and make some inappropriate joke about 50 Shades of Grey. No friends or family to comment that I'd paid for my crime, that I'd served my prison sentence. Or some of it, anyway. 5 years. It wasn't long enough for memories to fade. It wasn't even long enough to dull the nightmares that woke me 4 or 5 times a week. During the years spent inside, I'd refused all visitor requests from friends, and they'd eventually stopped asking. Joe, the one friend I would have allowed to visit, my oldest, closest friend, never asked. My parents visited the first week I was there, but their devastation almost killed me, so I refused to see them again. They wrote, though, rambling letters full of nothing that always ended by telling me how much they loved me, and how they looked forward to welcoming me home after my release. Less than a year later, I had a letter from them to say they were moving to Portugal. I cried when I read it. Had they got tired of running the gauntlet of critical eyes on their way to and from local shops? Had my proud mother grown weary of trying to avoid certain neighbours? And my dear father, who loved to boast about his youngest daughter, had he got tired of biting his tongue? Thanks to me, to what I'd done, they left a home they'd lived in for almost 30 years. They made it clear there'd still be a home for me and sent regular letters during the following years. I read them, and the occasional ones from my brothers and sister, devoured their news, but never replied to any of them. It was better that they forgot about me. They didn't need to know how dismal my life was. As my next of kin, my parents would have been informed of my death, so they knew I was alive. They'd been told of my early release date, and a few days before it arrived, I had a letter from them to say they'd deposited sufficient funds in an account to enable me to buy somewhere to live. They begged me to get in touch, told me I'd always be welcome in Portugal, that there was a room for me, that they loved me. I didn't weaken. I wouldn't go to Portugal to taint their new life with my mess. Nor did I reply to their letter, not even to thank them for their unbelievable generosity. If I had, I'd have struggled to have hidden how lost and desperate I was, how afraid I was of being unable to cope. They'd have read between the lines and jumped on the next flight home. I couldn't do it to them. I'd made them suffer enough. My older sister and 2 brothers had written too, with an invitation to come and stay with them. Perhaps they'd even meant it. In the years I'd been away, the euphemism made me smile and I quickly corrected the thought. In the years I'd been in prison, all 3 had married, and between them, they'd produced 5 children. I'd cried when I'd read their news. Tears of joy, tears of sadness for all I was missing. Like my parents, my siblings were good people. They didn't need the embarrassment of having to explain where their sister had been for the last few years or what she'd done. I gave nobody my new address. When I was settled in, I sent a thank you card to my parents. I described the home I'd bought with their money and the job I'd started. I managed to make my dull life sound content and as close to the fresh start I knew they wanted for me. Since I'd been released 2 months before, the only person I'd spoken to outside of work was my probation officer, or offender manager, as I was told to call the man who'd looked at me with cold eyes and little liking the first time we'd met. I tried not to care, and not wish once again I could turn the clock back to a different time. This was my reality now. The 5 years in prison had helped to drum that into me. "Why did you come to Barnstable?" he'd asked at our first meeting. It would have been nice to have had a ready answer, to have been able to say it had been a place with happy memories. I wasn't sure he'd have cared, but it would have been nice to say it, rather than having to admit the town itself was a random choice, and once the decision had been made, I'd rented, then rushed to buy the first anyway suitable house, followed by taking the first available job in a local supermarket. I heard it was a nice town to live in. I'd absolutely no idea if it was or not. It didn't matter. I'd wanted somewhere a long way from London, a town big enough to get lost in, rather than a city that would swallow me. I'd have liked to have been near the sea, and did look at a few places with beaches, waves, and big skies, but the prices made me chuckle. My parents' generosity didn't stretch to buying such desirable properties. Barnstable was a compromise. On a river, it was also on a bus route to the coast and had a train station should I ever have the need to return to the capital. I depended on public transport since I'd been disqualified from driving after the crash. My offender manager frowned at his computer screen, then spared me a glance. "You can apply to have your driving licence reinstated in a year. You'll need to have blood tests for alcohol dependency markers beforehand." "I don't drink anymore," I shrugged. "But it doesn't matter. I'm not interested in getting my licence back." He stared at me for a moment, as if trying to decide if I was telling the truth. I suppose in his line of business, it was an occupational hazard to never know whether to trust or not. I'm not sure what he'd decided about me, but his attention was back on the computer screen, his fingers flying over the keyboard. I wondered what he was writing about me. He stopped, frowned at the screen as he read what he'd written, then tapped another few keys before looking back at me. "You don't have family or friends nearby. Is that going to be a problem?" "I don't want to meet up with either family or old friends. It's why I chose to move away from London, away from the life I knew." I didn't mention starting afresh. He, as well as I, knew it was a fallacy. You couldn't start afresh. Your past tagged along regardless. I could have told him about the problems worrying me, the screams that woke me as they pierced the dark quiet of the night, or startled me in the brighter stillness of the day. Sounds from the past I was never going to escape. I could also have told him about the voices I heard when I woke at night. My dead friends, Suki, Deb and Frida, calling out to me. Or the newer one that had started since my release. The voice of the woman I used to be, constantly telling me I needed to get on with my life. I could have told my offender manager all of this, and would have done if his bored expression hadn't said, as clearly as words, he didn't care what problems the sad ex-con sitting on the other side of the desk had. So I kept the screams and the voices to myself. Chapter 3. Keep my head down. That was my mantra. The supermarket where I worked on the checkout till was a 10-minute walk from home. I hugged the buildings as I walked there, shoulders hunched, eyes down. Sometimes, for diversion, I counted the cracks in the pavement between my front door and the staff entrance to the supermarket. Once, I'd counted the wads of chewing gum that dotted my route. It was a small, busy supermarket. The customers were mostly local, and after almost a month working there, I recognised many of those who came in. The other checkout staff were happy to chat to customers. I kept my conversation to the minimum. Thank you. Have a nice day. It was the longest sentence I used, and I said it several times an hour without altering the words. My eyes flicked up to acknowledge the customer, then I concentrated my attention on getting the product scanned as quickly as possible. Sometimes I'd look up and would swear it was Suki, Deb or Frida standing there looking at me, with a sneer curling their lips. Once I was convinced I'd heard their laughter, the sound so clear, so fucking real. I left my till and walked up and down the aisles in search of them. The other staff, even some of the customers, looked at me askance. Some of the regular customers began to join the queue for the other tills where the staff were friendlier, rather than join the shorter one at mine. It didn't bother me. I wasn't there to be friends. You used to care a lot that people liked you. There she was again, my old self, reminding me, in case I'd forgotten, that I was a changed person. I wasn't interested in the customers or in being pally with any of the staff either. They soon gave up trying to engage me in conversation and stopped inviting me to the occasional after-work drink in a local pub. The manager was aware of my past, of course. Sometimes I wondered if he'd dropped a quiet word in the ear of the other staff, or if it was my attitude that caused them to look at me suspiciously. It didn't matter. Nothing did, except getting through the days. That day being a Wednesday, my shift finished at 2. I trudged home, wondering which TV programme to watch to help pass the rest of the day before it was time to go to bed and hope not to dream. I was on my street, only a few doors from home, when I saw someone on the doorstep of the house next door. In the month I'd lived there, I'd never seen anyone enter or leave it. If I'd given it any thought, I'd have assumed it was empty, perhaps awaiting a sale, but truth was, I wasn't curious enough to care. I didn't care now either, nor did I want to get involved in what was an obvious argy-bargy. The man on the doorstep was leaning forward, his stance aggressively threatening, and it was his angry raised voice I heard as I took a few steps closer. I darted a look across the road. I could cross, walk further ahead, cross back and approach my front door from the other direction, not get involved with whatever was going on. The plan should have worked, and it would have done if I hadn't stupidly made the mistake of glancing towards the open door as I passed. The man was still angrily gesticulating, but now I could see the recipient of his anger. A tiny woman, maybe half his height, and although I couldn't see her clearly, I could tell she was old. Maybe even very old. What are you waiting for? That irritating voice in my head was correct. The old me wouldn't have hesitated for a second. What about keeping my head down? The more battle-scarred woman I was now sighed heavily. It might be stupid to get involved, but hopefully, this time, my stupidity might save lives and not cost them. Without breaking stride, I altered direction and crossed the road to within a few feet of the man. "Hi," I said, injecting as much cheer as I could into the one word and grinning widely. He immediately turned, looking annoyed, then puzzled. "Who the fuck are you?" I waved towards my door, only feet away. "I'm Chloe. I live next door. I was invited to lunch." I looked at the woman. Very old was correct. She had to be at least 90. "You haven't forgotten, I hope? I'm absolutely starving." She might be old, but she wasn't a fool. "No, of course I haven't. Come in. Terence was just leaving." Terence didn't seem to be getting the message. "I'll just squeeze by you there, if I may," I said, edging between the bulk of the man and the door. I stood behind the older woman and kept my eyes fixed on his face. He had close-cut hair and stubble I bet he thought made him look ruggedly rough. A man you'd have labelled handsome until you noticed the shifty eyes and the narrow-lipped, mean mouth. I'd met plenty of men like him in my day, men who thought they could bully their way through every situation. I kept his gaze while he looked from one to the other of us, as if wondering what his next play should be. Then, to my relief, because I'd used up my allowance of courage for the day, he swore loudly and stormed off, his steel-toed shoes almost sparking the pavement as he walked. "Interesting person," I said into the silence that followed his departure. The older woman turned to look at me. "He was a kind boy, but he's turned into a mean man." She took a last glance down the street before shutting the door. "Thank you. I have to admit he was exhausting me." She lifted a hand to her forehead. "I'm only back a few hours." She gave a quick smile that wrinkled her entire face. "Now I'm sorry I didn't stay a little longer." I saw the smile tremble and guessed she was close to tears. I surprised myself by waving to the room behind. "Why don't I make you a cup of tea? I'm Chloe, by the way, and I really do live next door." "I'm Tilda, and a cup of tea would be very nice, thank you." I led the way. It was easy. The house was a mirror image of mine, but whereas mine was grey and dull, this was bright, cheerful, and incredibly cluttered. "Why don't you sit?" I said, pointing to a chair in the small dining room. "I'll find where everything is." It didn't take long. It might be cluttered, but the cupboards were neatly arranged. Less than 5 minutes later, I was carrying a laden tray through. "I found biscuits," I said, putting the tray down. "I'm partial to a digestive." Since there was 6 packets in one of the cupboards, that had been clear. I poured the tea, picked up a biscuit and dunked it. "You said you were only back a few hours?" "Yes, from hospital. Well, rehabilitation, actually. I broke my hip 3 months ago. Then to complicate things, I got pneumonia. It took me longer to get back on my feet as a result." She lifted the mug of tea in 2 hands and took a sip. "Terence is my grandson. He wants me to give him power of attorney so he can handle my affairs." If I hadn't seen the man for myself and decided he was a thug, I'd have guessed from the woman's tone of voice she wasn't handing him that kind of power. "You don't trust him?" She put her mug down and reached for a biscuit. Breaking it in 4, she popped a quarter into her mouth, chewed and swallowed it before she sighed. "As I said, he was a good boy. I know it's a bit of a cliché, but he got in with the wrong crowd in his teens and never managed to claw his way out again." She leaned a little closer and whispered, "And he's been in prison." As if that said it all. To some people, it did. Was it how I'd be defined for the rest of my life? If I told this nice woman I too had been a guest of His Majesty, would she look horrified and ask me to leave? I couldn't hold being in prison against the man, but I could condemn him for shouting and trying to intimidate a woman who was recovering from an operation, especially a woman as old as his grandmother appeared to be. Although not as old as I'd first thought, maybe closer to 80 than 90. You don't need a walking stick to get around? No, thank goodness I don't. The physio where I was staying was excellent, and I did everything they told me to. She smiled and suddenly looked even younger. I might be getting old. It doesn't mean I want to look it, and having to use a walking stick struck me as being the start of a slippery slope. Is there someone else in your family who you could nominate to have power of attorney? It would stop your grandson worrying about you, wouldn't it? You really think he worries about me? I didn't. If he'd been worried, he wouldn't have inflicted that tirade on his grandmother. Perhaps not. However, if someone else did have power of attorney, he'd have to stop annoying you about it, wouldn't he? Is there another family member you could nominate? Someone you trust? Terence's mother, Evie, is my daughter. Her husband died 8 years ago. She's had a few... Tilda curled her forefinger in the air to make quotation marks. Romances since. She hadn't needed to make the quotation marks. The word reeked of sarcasm. You didn't approve? She sniffed. Losers, every one of them. More than one has left her with debts. I help her out when I can, but... She shrugged and left it there. It sounded as if the daughter wasn't a good option for power of attorney. You could simply nominate your solicitor to handle everything. Yes, I could. Tilda reached for another quarter of her biscuit. It wasn't something I was worried about until I broke my hip. It hits you then how fragile life can be. I don't want to be kept alive with tubes and things, you know. Better to be let go with dignity. For a week after the crash, I'd been kept alive with tubes and things. Many times since, I wished I had died that night. There would have been no dignity in my death. They'd still have blamed me for what happened, but at least it would have been over. I wouldn't be forced to live each day with the weight of guilt crushing me. How could it not? My 3 friends and a stranger had died in the crash, and I'd been to blame. Chapter 4. Terence came to visit me a few times while I was in hospital, Tilda said. Every time I could see disappointment on his face. He'd have been happier if I'd died. His mother would inherit what little I have, and he'd have managed to squeeze more than his fair share out of her. I was suddenly sorry I hadn't stuck to my plan to stay on the far side of the road and sneak into my house without drawing the attention of a man who seemed more and more like a monster. I'm sure he doesn't think that, I said, not sure at all. Tilda reached for more of the biscuit. He thinks he's a lot smarter than he is. It's why he thinks he should have power of attorney, but to be honest, I'd be afraid he'd be tempted to help himself and make decisions based on what was good for him rather than what was good for me. I felt pretty sure he would have done. I'd say he's got the message now. Before you see him again, it might be a good idea to contact your solicitor, get it all signed and sealed, then when your grandson asks about it again, you can say it's been sorted. Good idea. Yes, but one she wasn't going to take. I could tell by the tone of her voice and the resigned expression on her face. It was a blood-is-thicker-than-water scenario. Despite knowing her grandson was a wrong-un, she'd probably prefer to trust him than a stranger. There wasn't anything I could do to persuade someone who didn't want to be told. Right, I said, and put the empty mug down on the tray. I'll take this back into the kitchen, then I'd better go. Yes, of course, and thank you again for coming to my rescue. It was kind of you. You're welcome, Mrs. Lewis, Matilda Lewis, but call me Tilda. Everyone does. Mrs. Lewis reminds me of my mother-in-law, and I couldn't abide the old cow. I gave the required laugh and took the tray back to the kitchen. There didn't appear to be a dishwasher. I rinsed the mug and left it to drain. When I turned, Tilda was standing in the doorway. "I have to admit, it's nice to have someone on that side again," she said, nodding to the party wall. "It's been empty for the last year." I hadn't been curious about the previous owner. I wasn't now, but saw the expectation on Tilda's face, so felt obliged to ask, "Who lived there before?" "You don't know the story?" I didn't, and, judging by her expression, I knew I didn't want to know either, because it was obviously a horrible story, and I'd had enough of that in my life. But, with the cat half out of the bag, I'd no choice but to invite it to come out all the way. "No, I didn't hear anything." Nor had the estate agent volunteered any information. I wondered how relieved he'd been that I hadn't asked anything about the previous owner. Without knowing the story, I guessed whatever it was responsible for the agent jumping to accept my below-asking price offer. "I'm surprised you didn't hear. It was all over the news last year." I shook my head and waited. Tension crept over me. It tightened my features into a mask of neutrality and gripped my shoulders. Whatever the old woman told me, it couldn't be nearly as bad as the nightmare I had lived through. The destruction I had caused. Or maybe it would be much worse and would put my own drama into context. Knock it down a notch on the scale of horrors. I tried to put my story from my mind and concentrate on what Tilda was telling me. There was the light of excitement in her eyes at being the one to have the dubious pleasure of regaling the new neighbour with the tale. She pulled out a stool and lowered herself slowly onto it. "I can't stand for long periods yet." I glanced down the hallway to the front door. My escape route. "You must be exhausted. We should leave this for another day." One I'd do my best to ensure never arrived. Tilda flapped a hand. "Nonsense, I'm fine." She shuffled back on her seat and rested against the wall behind. "It was last July," she said. "Remember we had that heat wave?" I wished she would get on with the story rather than trying to make it into an interactive experience. I should simply confess I'd been locked away last year, so had no recollection of it being particularly warm. "Yes, I remember. It was melting hot." Tilda smiled. "It was. Melting is right." If the conversation was going to drift into stories of how hot it had been, I was going to make my excuses and leave. I should have left as soon as that dreadful man had gone. Shouldn't have got involved in the first place. "I think it was the heat that did it," Tilda said. "You wouldn't have noticed it yet, but the street outside is narrow, and when it gets hot, barely a breeze makes its way down. No matter how many windows we open, it's hard to keep the house cool when it gets hot. In July, some people took to keeping their front doors open out of desperation. Not me, though." She shook her head quickly as if to say she hadn't been so stupid. "But your neighbours did," I said, hoping to cut the story short. "And someone broke in and, killed them?" But Tilda wasn't having her moment dimmed. "It was maybe the second week of the heat wave. Marcy," she nodded her head toward the house next door. "She had a bit of weight on her after having the babies and was feeling the heat more as a result." She ran a measuring eye up and down me. "Not that you're ever going to have a problem, are you? Skinny bit of a thing you are. Greyhound breed." I sighed, refusing to take offence. Tilda was of a generation who seemed to think it was perfectly acceptable to comment on people's weight. Anyway, she was correct. I was skinny. Prison food hadn't agreed with me. "I exercise a lot," I said, wondering how many more lies I was going to tell, all in the name of the fresh start I'd never believed in. "Marcy couldn't get the house cool enough. She had fans in almost every room." Tilda sniffed. "All they did was blow the hot air about. She needed to buy one of those air conditioning units, but she wouldn't be told." I wondered how many times Tilda had informed the poor woman she was wasting her time. Marcy left all the windows open and her front and back door. I told her she should shut the front one, that it wasn't safe, but she wouldn't listen. Then, when the heat wave looked to be never-ending, she took to leaving the doors open all night too. All night? That did surprise me. This was Barnstable, not London, but even here it wasn't wise to offer an invitation to any passing criminal. Someone got in during the night. Tilda took a breath, then with almost ghoulish delight, finished. And murdered both Marcy and her husband. Murdered. It was a far weightier word than killed. The legal teams for the victims of the crash I had caused had insisted their deaths should be classified as murder, that I had got behind the wheel of the car knowing I was incapacitated and had therefore intentionally caused their deaths. My legal team, of course, argued they'd been killed accidentally, that my intention had never been for them to die. The argument seemed a waste of breath to me. It didn't change anything. My friends were just as dead, whichever word they used. How unbelievably ironic to think I had fled London for a new start in Barnstable, only to end up living in a house where people had been murdered. It was almost amusing. Almost amusing, too, to see how eager Tilda was to share her knowledge. I didn't want to hear the details of how the couple had been murdered in their beds, but she'd obviously devoured everything written about it and was determined to tell me all she knew. They'd both been stabbed, in their sleep, they think, because there were no defensive injuries on either of them. Of course, they did like their drink, so it might have been that both were out for the count. I hoped she wasn't going to launch into a discussion about the evils of drink. If she did, I would leave, and to hell with being a good neighbour. But Tilda merely shook her head before continuing with the other shocking details of the night of the murder. Their 2-year-old twin girls were found crying for their ma the following morning. She stopped for a moment to allow the horror of it to sink in. Nobody was ever caught for the murders. For weeks after, there wasn't a window left open on this street, never mind a door. Despite myself, I was intrigued. And regardless of my close relationship with death, I couldn't help being a little shocked, too. Was it a burglary gone wrong? Not according to the reports I read. There was nothing taken. She sniffed. Not that they'd anything worth taking, anyway. We're hardly Millionaire's Row along here. It was without doubt a horrendous crime. Did it beat mine? Was there some measure as to how horrific a crime was? Maybe there were extra points for mass murder. And perhaps homicide was a worse crime because it involved your friends. Was I really playing some dreadful game of one-upmanship? What kind of a sick bitch was I? I waited for the voice in my head to say a very, very sick one, but for a change, there was nothing. Tilda, however, was patiently waiting for some response from me. What a shocking story, I said. Mine was worse. Mine was much, much worse. My old self never remained speechless for long, and the words echoed painfully around my skull. Yes, so you be careful, Tilda said. Keep your doors locked when you're at home, and your front windows shut at all times. I smiled and resisted the temptation to tell her it didn't matter whether doors and windows were left open or not. Dreadful things happened regardless. Yes, I will. I indicated the front door with a tilt of my head. I'd better get going. Thanks for the tea. Tilda looked a little disappointed at my calm acceptance of the murders. Had she expected me to be devastated because I'd bought a house with such a terrible history? I should have been, I suppose. Would it have been more normal to have leapt to my feet with a squeal of horror? I wasn't sure anymore. It might be that what I'd done had desensitized me to the succession of tragedies life insisted on doling out. Sometimes I felt numb to everything. Tilda, I noticed, was looking at me with increased curiosity. I managed a smile. "Don't get up, I'll let myself out." I shut her front door behind me and turned to walk the short distance to mine. Movement at the corner of the street caught my attention, and I looked up to see a familiar face. Terence. Although several feet away, there was no mistaking his angry expression or his rigid, aggressive stance. It seemed I'd made myself an enemy. I could have walked over to him and told him to join the queue, that the list of people who hated me was long and I wasn't sure when there'd be a gap for him. He might be a thug, capable of terrorizing old women, but my mass murderer status topped that easily. Chapter 5. I was brought out of the induced coma a week after the crash. The staff looking after me told me I'd been in an accident and I was safe and recovering. I spent 2 more days in intensive care, mostly barely conscious, before I was transferred to a medical ward. Every time I opened my eyes, my parents were there, and when I tried to speak, when I tried to ask how my friends were, my mother would hush me and tell me everything was all right, that I needed to rest and get better. Once, I opened my eyes to see a nurse checking my intravenous line. My first hello was a low, croaky sound and didn't manage to attract her attention over the beeps of various monitors. I tried again. "Hello." Still a croak, but a louder one that worked. "Hello?" She smiled down at me. "You're not in pain, are you?" "No, I'm okay. My mother isn't here." She shook her head. "It's the middle of the night." "Hard to tell," I said with a little laugh. "Can you tell me how my friends are doing?" "I'll try to find out and get back to you." She didn't, and the next time I opened my eyes, it was morning and my mother was there again. The neuro consultant came to visit me my first day in the medical ward. He reassured me that he expected me to make a full recovery in due course, while at the same time told me I might never remember the hours before, during and after the crash. Shocked by the gap in my memory, I didn't think to question him any further, or to ask how long due course might be. That came later. Only after he'd seen me and had given me the all clear, did my mother, who'd barely left my bedside since admission, sit down beside me, take my hand, and told me the details of what had happened. "You were in a crash. You hit another car and went off the road. Do you remember?" "The last thing I remember is being in my apartment getting ready to go out. Then I woke up in here. The consultant said I might never remember what happened over those missing hours." My mother nodded. "The doctors your dad and I spoke to said your memory might be impaired." She sighed and squeezed the hand she held. "Jo was in the passenger seat. She broke her leg and had several nasty lacerations, but otherwise she's okay." Jo was my oldest friend. We'd grown up together, had attended the same schools and university. Our career paths had differed, but our friendship hadn't changed. It was a relief to know she was okay. "And the others?" "Suki, a friend from university. Deb, a friend from the school where I taught, and Frida, who worked for the same law firm as Jo. The 5 of us met at least once a week, sometimes camping out in one or other of our apartments on a Saturday night, and heading for a restorative breakfast on the Sunday morning. Occasionally, one or more of us dragged a boyfriend along, but currently we were all single. Often we'd use public transport, but the night of the crash we were heading to a new pub a little off the beaten track. We'd developed a plan for these occasions when we weren't sure of the place, how long we'd planned to stay, or the availability of taxis. It didn't happen often, but when it did, we took turns to drive. That night, it was my turn. With Jo in the passenger seat, the others would have been jammed into the back of my Fiesta. I had a vague memory we'd been laughing uproariously about something, or maybe that was wishful thinking. It was several seconds before I realised my mother hadn't answered. "Mum? Sorry, it's just—" My mother swallowed noisily. "They wanted to tell you, but I thought it was best coming from me." Tell me? I'd been badly injured, but I'd been in the front seat. I'd assumed it was where the bulk of the damage had occurred and my friends in the back seat had escaped unscathed. Or was it another case of wishful thinking? I guessed it was when I saw tears run down my mother's unusually pale cheeks. "Were they badly hurt? Is that it?" "When you hit the oncoming car?" Her voice trembled, and it took a few seconds before she was able to continue. "When you hit, your car flipped and hit a barrier when it landed. They didn't stand a chance." I'd had strange dreams since my coma. The consultant had said it was normal. Was this another of them? I was asleep and dreaming. My mother's hand squeezed mine. "Chloe, are you all right?" I wasn't dreaming. "They didn't stand a chance." I pulled my hand away and sat up straighter to look her in the eye. "Are you telling me they're all dead? Suki, Deb and Frida?" My mother pulled a ragged tissue from her pocket and wiped her eyes. "Suki was killed in the crash. Both Deb and Frida made it to the hospital and died a few hours later." Their faces came to me then, flickering before me in full colour. Snapshots of them at parties, nightclubs, lunches and dinners. Smiles and laughter, and almost tangible vitality. Their voices so clear, I turned to look towards the door, certain my mother had been mistaken, that they were coming through with armfuls of flowers and silly stuffed toys to jolly me into recovering, and no doubt to tease me about my driving. "I'm so sorry." My mother reached for my hand again. "I know how close you all were." The voices faded, as did the faces of my friends. I blinked and stared at my mother's tear-stained face. "They're really all dead?" "Yes, I'm afraid they are." "I don't remember anything about it." I lifted a hand to my suddenly throbbing head. How could I not remember? "It must have been one hell of a crash to have killed all three." "4. My mother brushed away tears, then squeezed my hand. "The driver of the car you crashed into, he died at the scene." 4. My 3 friends, and a man I didn't know. I wasn't sure I could take it in. And then, through a crack of clarity, something my mother had said struck me. The car I hit, the one I crashed into. "You're saying I crashed into the other car? I was to blame for what happened?" That couldn't be right. I was a notoriously careful driver. My friends... Oh, God, my friends. They had teased me about it. I saw a strange expression cross my mother's face. Maybe it was a leftover dullness from my head injury, because my first thought was she looked disappointed. My second, that she seemed resigned. "You'd been drinking," she said. And I heard something I'd never heard in my mother's voice before. The faintest hint of condemnation. I would have laughed if the news about the death of my friends and the unknown man hadn't numbed every emotion. It was a crazy thing for my mother to have said. I never drank when I was driving. Ever. "No, that's not true," I said when she continued to sit there silently judging me. "You know I never drink and drive." She held my gaze without flinching. "You never used to, that's true.